Never was there a more ambitious enterprise, nor one more completely ruined. Sir Walter Scott, on Napoleon's invasion of Russia. The year was 1812, and the world stood at the edge of madness. Europe had already burned once under Napoleon Bonaparte, and now the flames were returning, brighter and deadlier. Fade in, cold winds whip across the endless plains of Eastern Europe. The horizon, a sea of green and gold, stretches toward infinity, and at its heart, a single man dares to command destiny itself. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, conqueror of Europe, a man once seen as the very embodiment of human will, ambition made flesh. But ambition, when left unchecked, becomes a god of its own, and in the summer of 1812, Napoleon chose to challenge not an empire, but the land itself, vast, merciless, and eternal Russia. For a decade, Napoleon had rewritten the map of Europe. Austria, Prussia, Italy, Spain, all had bent the knee or burned. Crowned emperor in 1804, he had stood invincible at Austerlitz, masterful at Jena, and unbroken at Wagram. But the peace he created was fragile. A peace born not of harmony, but of exhaustion. At its core, Napoleon's empire depended on a single idea: the continental system. A blockade designed to strangle Britain's economy by closing every European port to English goods. Yet there was one ruler too vast to control, too stubborn to obey: Tsar Alexander I of Russia. And when Russia reopened its ports to British trade in defiance, Napoleon saw not diplomacy, but betrayal. The emperor's pride could not bear it. To him, Russia's defiance wasn't an act of policy, it was an insult. And so he made his fateful decision. He would march on Moscow. He would crush Russia's resistance. And he would remind the world that no one defied the will of Napoleon Bonaparte. The invasion was not a campaign, it was a vision of madness made real. In the summer of 1812, Europe watched in awe as Napoleon assembled what was perhaps the greatest army in history. Over 600,000 men. Soldiers from every corner of his empire: French, Polish, German, Italian, Dutch, Croat. A mosaic of nations bound under one man's command. They called it the Grand Armée. As they marched eastward through the fields of Poland and into the Russian frontier, Napoleon's confidence burned like the sun, unstoppable, blinding, absolute. The drums thundered, flags snapped in the wind, and tens of thousands of boots crushed the soil in rhythm, the pulse of empire. But beneath that glory marched something darker. Behind every cheer and every song lay fear, of distance, of hunger, of the unknown. The further they marched, the more Europe faded behind them, and the more Russia stretched before them, a land without end. In June, the Niemen River shimmered under the sun. Napoleon stood upon its banks, gazing toward the far side, toward Russia. He turned to his generals and said only one word: forward. The river was crossed, the die was cast, and Europe's greatest army vanished into the endless east. The Russians did not wait. They did not give battle. Instead, they retreated deeper and deeper, burning everything as they went. Crops, villages, bridges, entire towns turned to ash. It was a strategy of emptiness. The scorched earth. If Napoleon wanted Russia, he would have to conquer hunger itself. The French advanced through smoke and silence, finding no glory, only ashes. The land itself became an enemy. Horses died by the thousands. Men dropped from exhaustion. Supplies dwindled, morale shattered, and the heat of summer turned the plains into a shimmering oven. Still, Napoleon pressed forward. He believed the Russians would not dare let him reach Moscow. He believed they would turn and fight. And finally, they did. August 1812, Smolensk, the city burned. Smoke rolled across the sky as the French and Russians clashed in brutal urban combat. Streets turned into killing grounds. Walls collapsed under cannon fire. Men fought hand to hand in alleys filled with fire and blood. The French took Smolensk, but it was victory in name only. Thousands lay dead, and the city was nothing but ruins. The Russians had again retreated, their army battered, but unbroken. Napoleon stood on the city's charred ramparts, staring eastward. Somewhere beyond the smoke lay Moscow, the symbol of Russian might. He could almost see it, almost taste it. And so, against the advice of his marshals, he marched onward once more. As the army moved closer to Moscow, Napoleon's men began to lose something far greater than strength. They lost belief. They had expected victory after victory, swift and decisive. Instead, they found only devastation and death. The land was desolate, the wells were poisoned, and the peasants, once thought to welcome liberation, rose against them as partisans, ambushing convoys, slaughtering stragglers, burning what little food remained. Each night, the campfires of the Grand Armée burned smaller. Each morning, the ranks grew thinner. Yet Napoleon's determination remained ironclad. To retreat was to accept humiliation, and humiliation was death to his legend. He would find the Russian army, he would crush it, and then he would take Moscow and end the war. September 7, 1812. Near a small village west of Moscow, the sun rose red as blood over a sea of mist. Drums echoed across the fields, and cannons were drawn into position. It was here that destiny would decide the fate of Europe, at a place called Borodino. Of all my battles, the most terrible was that before Moscow. The French showed themselves worthy of victory, and the Russians of being invincible. Napoleon Bonaparte, 1812. The morning of September 7, 1812 dawned heavy and gray. The sky itself seemed uncertain, as if nature hesitated to witness what was about to unfold. Before Napoleon stretched the Russian army, commanded by General Mikhail Kutuzov, old, patient, shrewd. Behind the Russians lay the road to Moscow. And Napoleon knew, if he could crush them here, the war would end. But the Russians had no intention of surrendering their sacred soil without a reckoning. The battlefield at Borodino was a maze of redoubts, earthworks, and ravines, a killing ground carved and prepared for one purpose: to bleed the French dry. At dawn, cannons roared. The sky turned black with smoke. The ground shook beneath tens of thousands of marching boots. The battle that followed would become one of the bloodiest single days in European history, a day when courage and horror became indistinguishable. The Grand Battery, Napoleon's artillery, 600 guns, opened fire. The thunder was deafening. Shells ripped through the Russian lines, tearing men apart in bursts of earth and flame. Horses screamed, soldiers fell, and the air filled with dust and blood. Then came the infantry, wave after wave, advancing into hell. The Great Redoubt, the central Russian fortification, stood like a fortress of fire. French columns charged, were repelled, and charged again. Whole regiments were annihilated, only to be replaced by more. Napoleon watched from a distant hill, his spyglass steady. He could feel victory, just beyond reach. But the cost was monstrous. The field before him was a sea of corpses, and Kutuzov, grim, unflinching, refused to break. By midday, Borodino had become an inferno. Men fought with bayonets over walls of the dead. Drums beat through smoke, voices cried out in French, Polish, Russian, languages lost in the roar of cannon and the clash of steel. The sun disappeared behind a wall of ash. No one could see the sky anymore. Only flashes of musket fire, like lightning in a storm. For hours, the fighting surged back and forth. Villages burned to ash. Entire divisions vanished into the smoke. By late afternoon, Napoleon's marshals urged him to unleash his imperial guard, his last reserve, his hammer of destiny. He hesitated. For the first time in years, Napoleon, the man who had once gambled with empires, refused to risk it all. The guard remained idle, and when the sun finally set, the battle ended without victory. Borodino had no winners, only survivors. Over 70,000 men lay dead or wounded. The Russian army retreated bloodied, but unbroken. Napoleon held the field, but not his triumph. He had won a corpse of a victory. Days later, the French advanced toward Moscow, step by step through blackened villages and silent fields. The closer they came, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to die, And then, one gray afternoon in mid-September, the city appeared. Moscow, the crown of the Tsars, the heart of Holy Russia. Golden domes gleamed above a sea of rooftops. Napoleon's officers gasped. They expected resistance. But the city was silent. Moscow was empty. The French entered like ghosts. No cheers, no defenders. Only the sound of footsteps echoing through deserted streets. It was as if the soul of the city had fled. Napoleon stood before the Kremlin, gazing upon the ancient walls. At last, he thought, it was over. Surely Tsar Alexander would sue for peace now. Surely Russia would bow. He was wrong. That night, the winds shifted, and in the distance, a glow began to rise. Then another, and another. Within hours, the city was burning. Moscow, the holy city of Russia, was on fire. The flames spread faster than the wind itself, devouring streets, markets, cathedrals. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as the inferno raged out of control. The night sky turned crimson. Smoke blotted out the stars. Explosions ripped through the air as gunpowder stores ignited. The French panicked, trapped inside a burning city. Horses ran wild through the streets, soldiers looted what they could, and the fire consumed everything, even hope. The Russians had done the unthinkable. They had burned their own capital rather than surrender it. It was not an act of defeat. It was an act of defiance. Napoleon's triumph turned to ash. He waited in the Kremlin for a message from Tsar Alexander, a plea for peace, a surrender something. But none came. Days turned to weeks. The emperor, surrounded by destruction, realized the truth. The Russians would not yield. They would rather freeze the world itself than kneel. The fires eventually died, but the message burned. Eternal Moscow could be taken. But Russia could never be conquered. By October, winter approached, slow, silent, and merciless. Supplies ran out, the horses starved, the men grew restless, and still no peace arrived. Napoleon faced a decision, the kind that defines empires. To stay meant death, to retreat meant disgrace. At last, he ordered the unthinkable. The Grande Armée would leave Moscow. 600,000 men had marched into Russia. Now, fewer than half would march out, and the road home would become a graveyard. From the sublime to the ridiculous, there is but one step. Napoleon Bonaparte, 1812. Moscow was behind them now, but what lay ahead was far worse. The Grande Armée, once the pride of Europe, was now a shadow, half-starved, ragged and broken by despair. The Russian autumn was turning to winter, and in Russia, winter was not a season. It was a weapon. When Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat in October 1812, the men cheered, not from courage but relief. They believed they were going home. They didn't yet understand that the road home would lead through hell. The army set out from the smoking ruins of Moscow, 100,000 strong. Behind them, the city still smoldered. Before them, the long frozen plains waited in silence. The first snows fell within days. At first, they were beautiful, soft, white, almost gentle. But soon, the beauty turned to death. The temperature dropped. The roads vanished beneath ice, and the men began to die. Hunger came first. There was no food. The Russians had burned everything. Starving soldiers ate horseflesh, leather, even bark stripped from trees. Then came exhaustion and the cold. It was not merely cold, it was cosmic. The kind of cold that silences the world. At 40 below, gunpowder refused to fire. Fingers froze to muskets. Wounds turned black within hours. Entire battalions disappeared into the snow, leaving only footprints that the wind erased. And still, the Russians followed. Kutuzov's army and the Cossacks, savage, relentless, trailed the retreating French like wolves, circling, slashing, killing stragglers by the thousands. Every village became a battlefield, every bridge a trap. Napoleon's once grand army had become a caravan of ghosts. The soldiers who had marched in perfect formation through Europe now stumbled like beggars through the blizzard. Uniforms torn, boots gone, hands wrapped in rags. Their eyes, hollow, distant, stared not ahead but inward. They no longer dreamed of victory, Only survival. At Smolensk, the emperor hoped to find supplies, but the warehouses were empty. The food had rotted, the forage destroyed. Desperation turned to chaos, men killing each other for a crust of bread. From the forests came the crack of rifles. Russian partisans, farmers, peasants, patriots, harassed the retreat, striking like shadows and vanishing again. No mercy was given, none was expected. The Grande Armée was not retreating, it was dying. By November, the snowstorms became blizzards. Winds howled across the steppe like the cries of the dead. The sun no longer rose. It merely glowed behind the fog, pale and lifeless. The French soldiers called it the White Death. And they were not wrong. Men froze standing. Entire artillery trains vanished beneath drifts of snow. Horses collapsed in their traces and were stripped to the bone within minutes. Officers burned maps for warmth. Cannonballs were used as pillows by men who would never wake. The army that had once terrified Europe was now reduced to silence. And then came the crossing of the Berezina River, the last great ordeal. It was late November when Napoleon reached the river near Borisov. The bridges were gone. The Russians were closing in from all sides. The water was freezing swollen black, a death trap. There was no time to build proper bridges, but the engineers of the army, the unsung heroes, worked day and night, waist, deep in icy water, hammering together a way out. Many drowned as they worked, their bodies freezing to the timbers. On November 26th, the crossing began. Thousands of soldiers, wagons, and civilians pushed across the fragile bridges as Russian cannon fire rained down. The air was filled with screams, smoke, and chaos. Bridges collapsed under the weight. Men plunged into the icy current and vanished. But somehow, impossibly, Napoleon's core army made it across. It was no victory. It was survival and nothing more. When the emperor finally reached Vilnius, only a fraction of his army remained. Out of the 600,000 who had marched into Russia, fewer than 40,000 returned. The rest, gone. Frozen, starved, captured, or simply lost forever in the snow. The invasion had begun as the march of an empire. It ended as the funeral of an army. Napoleon himself barely escaped capture. By December, he left his shattered army and raced back to Paris in a sleigh to preserve the illusion of control. To show France her emperor still lived. He would fight again. He would rise again. But the magic was gone. The legend of invincibility had died somewhere in the frozen wastes of Russia. And Europe would never be the same. The invasion of Russia was more than a military catastrophe. It was a lesson written in ice and blood. That ambition has limits. That even the greatest empires can be humbled by nature, by endurance, by the will of a people defending their home. As the snow melted and spring came again, the bones of the Grande Armée lay scattered across the steppe, mute witnesses to the arrogance of conquest. And from that silence rose the truth that has haunted empires ever since: you can conquer nations, but you cannot conquer winter. The story of Napoleon's invasion of Russia isn't just about battles and borders. It's about pride, resilience, and the moment when one man's ambition collided with the endless might of nature. If you want to uncover more forgotten moments like this, the wars, betrayals, and turning points that shaped our world, then don't just watch history, discover it. Subscribe to Unsolved History and join us as we reveal the stories that changed everything. The stories the world tried to forget.